It was the summer of 1942, and the heat seemed to hang heavily over the small town in the heartland of America. The trees swayed lazily in the gentle breeze as the music of a local band filled the air, signaling the start of another community celebration. Everyone in town knew this event. It was the annual gathering that brought together families, friends, and sometimes lonely souls searching for meaning in such uncertain time. Josh stood there, watching the sea of familiar and unfamiliar faces. He was a young man with a steady gaze, but there was something in his eyes that revealed a restlessness, a premonition that this summer might be his last before the war took him far away. He wasn't there to have fun, but to escape the news that kept coming, like distant thunder heralding the storm. And then he saw her. Anna. She seemed to float across the lawn like a vision. Her simple white dress contrasted with the dark hair that fell loosely over her shoulders. Josh couldn't look away. It was as if time had stopped, and the music, the conversations, and the surrounding buzz became mere distant whispers. She was laughing with a friend, but suddenly, her eyes met Josh's, and in that moment, something inside him changed forever. Without knowing exactly how, he approached her, the words fighting to come out as anxiety tightened his chest. "Hi," he said, feeling almost foolish at the simplicity of the greeting. But Anna smiled, a smile that lit up her entire being. "Hi," she replied, and in that simple exchange, they connected in a way that few understand, but everyone desires. They talked for hours, drifting away from the party to walk along the river that cut through the town. The water reflected the stars, and it seemed as though the universe conspired for these two strangers to meet at that place, on that night. Every word exchanged, every glance, only strengthened the bond forming between them. Josh, who had so often felt lost, found in Anna a reason to believe in something greater than the war looming on the horizon. And Anna, who had always been so reserved, discovered in Josh someone with whom she could share her deepest dreams. They spoke of the future, a future they knew was uncertain, but at that moment, it seemed to be the only thing that mattered. "Do you believe in destiny?" Josh asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability he rarely let show. Anna looked at him, her eyes shining with the same intensity as the stars above them. "I do now," she replied, her hand slipping into his, sealing a silent promise that no matter what came, they would face it together. That night, under the starry sky of a summer already beginning to fade, Josh and Anna didn't just fall in love. They found in each other an anchor, something to hold on to while the world around them seemed on the brink of falling apart. And as the music continued to play, distant and forgotten, they stood there, wrapped in a silence that spoke more than words ever could. After that night in the park, Josh couldn't get Anna out of his mind. Every thought, every moment of silence was filled with her image, the sound of her laughter, the sparkle in her eyes that seemed to hide an entire world. From that day on, Josh's world revolved around Anna. He was fascinated, almost obsessed, with an intensity he couldn't even understand himself. They began meeting regularly, but never alone. Anna's father, a strict and protective man, was always nearby, watching with sharp, suspicious eyes. He knew the reputation of young soldiers, who saw the town's girls as mere distractions before they left for the war. Josh felt the weight of that gaze on him, but Anna's father's constant presence only served to intensify his feelings. Each stolen moment, each smile shared under the old man's silent watch, made their love even more precious, like a treasure that needed to be protected. They would stroll through the park, walking side by side in silence, with Anna's father following a few steps behind, always vigilant. There was a tranquility in the park that contrasted with the turmoil Josh felt inside. The trees swayed gently, and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot was like music only the two of them could hear. Josh, as much as he wanted to, rarely touched Anna's hand. A touch that seemed simple for other couples was, for them, charged with an emotion that transcended understanding. It was a silent promise, a vow of something that went beyond words. They also frequented the town square, a place where children played and the elderly sat to tell stories of times past. To others, the square was a common place, but for Josh and Anna, each meeting there was a moment etched in time, a memory they knew they would need to hold on to for the uncertain days to come. Anna, always aware of her father's presence, spoke little, but her eyes said everything. There was a sadness in them, a silent acknowledgement that each of these moments together was fleeting, something that needed to be cherished to the fullest because they knew time was not on their side. Josh wanted to promise Anna the world. He wanted to say he would protect her from everything, that nothing could separate them. But instead, He just smiled at her, trying to convey with a look all that his heart desired. And Anna, with the same silent intensity, held on to that look, treasuring it as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Each goodbye at the end of their walks was painful, weighted with a heaviness that seemed to grow with each meeting. Josh watched as Anna was led away by her father, looking back one last time before disappearing down the street. He stood there, watching her go, knowing that the promises made in silence were the only ones he could keep at that moment. And so, day after day, their love grew under the constant shadow of war and separation. A love that blossomed in the parks and squares of the town, but was destined to face a storm that neither of them could foresee. The letter arrived on a cold, cloudy morning, the kind of day when the sky seems to reflect the uncertainty that plagues the heart. Josh opened the door to his small house and found the envelope there, resting on the mat like a harbinger of the fate he feared. The government seal was unmistakable, and he felt a knot tighten in his throat even before he tore the paper open. He read the words mechanically, but the impact of them hit him like a blow to the stomach. He knew this moment would come, but that didn't make the news any less devastating. He would have to go fight, leave everything he knew behind, including Anna. When he met her that afternoon, Josh's eyes carried a shadow that hadn't been there before. Anna, seeing him from afar, knew something was terribly wrong. They met in the park where they had so often walked, where their laughter once echoed carefree. Now, the silence between them was almost palpable, heavy with the words they both feared to say. "I got the letter," Josh murmured, his voice low, almost swallowed by the wind that began to blow through the trees. Anna froze, the blood draining from her face. She didn't need to ask which letter. She knew. Everyone knew. "When," was all she could manage to say, the word coming out as an almost inaudible whisper. "In 2 weeks," he replied, unable to meet her eyes. Instead, he looked at the horizon, as if the vastness of the sky could offer some sort of solace. But there was no solace there, only the emptiness of an impending separation. Anna swallowed hard, feeling the crushing weight of what was to come. "I can't lose you, Josh," she said, her voice breaking as tears began to stream down her face. Josh turned to her then, and the pain in his eyes mirrored the same agony burning in Anna's heart. He held her close, pulling her in, trying to imprint the warmth of her body against his, the sound of her breathing, the sweet scent of her hair into his memory. "I'll come back for you, Anna, for you," he promised with a firmness he didn't fully feel. "I'll come back, and we'll get married like we planned. Nothing's going to keep us apart." They embraced with an almost desperate urgency, as if the physical contact could somehow defy time, could somehow stop the inevitable. Anna's tears soaked Josh's shoulder, and he felt his heart break a little more with each muffled sob. "Wait for me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Wait for me, and I promise I'll come back to you." Anna could only nod, unable to speak. The words, the ones that needed to be said, seemed trivial in the face of what they were feeling. Instead, they stood there, clinging to each other like shipwrecked survivors in the midst of a storm, both terrified of what the future held. Time seemed to stretch and speed up simultaneously, like sand slipping through their fingers. The farewell was imminent, and the fear of the unknown hung in the air, dense and oppressive. They knew the promises made in that moment were all they had, but they also knew that in war, promises weren't always kept. When they finally parted, Josh felt a void he had never experienced before, as if a part of him had been left behind with Anna. He walked away without looking back, knowing that if he did, he might never find the strength to leave. And Anna stood there, alone in the park that now seemed lifeless, holding on to Josh's promise with all the strength she had, as the reality of the approaching war loomed, relentless, like a storm ready to break. The war had turned Josh's life into a whirlwind of chaos and horror. The battlefield was a place where time lost all meaning, and death became a constant companion, lurking like a shadow that never left. The deafening sound of gunfire, the smell of gunpowder and blood, and the sight of comrades falling around him were realities he could never erase from his memory. But amidst all this despair, there was one thing that kept Josh tethered to sanity, one thing that made him believe that somehow he still belonged to the world he had left behind: Anna's letters. The letters arrived with the regularity of a miracle in a place where hope seemed impossible. Each stained envelope, each sheet of paper worn from handling, was a lifeline that connected him to a life that, although distant, still existed. Josh waited for them with the anxiety of a drowning man spotting a lifebuoy. When he finally received them, He would withdraw from the other soldiers, seeking a solitary spot where he could devour every word, every line, as if they were the very reason to keep fighting. Anna wrote with a tenderness that brutally contrasted with the environment Josh lived in. She wrote about simple things, like how the flowers in her garden were blooming, about a new dress she had bought, about how the weather was changing, getting colder. But even in the most mundane descriptions, there was an undercurrent of pain, a veiled awareness of Josh's suffering, of the burden he carried. Anna never asked directly about the war. Instead, she offered him a refuge, a reminder that there was still beauty in the world. In return, Josh wrote about what he could, avoiding details that might tarnish the purity of Anna's letters. He wrote about the weather, about the food they ate, about the friends he had made, but he never mentioned the names of those who had fallen, nor did he describe the true horror surrounding him. He didn't want her world to be tainted by his. In one of the letters, Josh found a piece of blue ribbon that Anna had placed between the pages. He held that ribbon between his calloused fingers, feeling a wave of almost unbearable emotion. It was a small gift, something she would have worn in her hair, and now it was there with him, as if she had sent a piece of herself for him to carry. "Josh, I think of you every day," one of the letters said. "I wonder where you are, what you're doing. I worry about you. And at the same time, I hold on to the hope that soon you'll be back. Sometimes I close my eyes and imagine that you're here, by my side, walking in the park like we used to. That gives me strength to keep going." Those words were what kept Josh going, what made him push forward, even when everything seemed lost. He kept the letters carefully, tied with a blue ribbon, and read them over and over, in every brief moment of calm between battles. It was as if each reading renewed his spirit, as if Anna's voice, echoing from the pages, reminded him that he still had something worth fighting for. On one of the darkest, quietest nights, when the stars were covered by clouds and the cold cut like knives, Josh sat alone, the most recent letter from Anna open on his lap. He couldn't read the words, his eyes blurred with tears, but it didn't matter. Just knowing she had written, that she still believed in him, was enough. The front grew darker and heavier with each passing day, as if the very air was saturated with death and despair. For Josh, the days blurred into an endless sequence of battles, exhausting marches, and sleepless nights. Then, suddenly, the letters stopped coming. At first, Josh tried not to despair. Maybe the mail was delayed. Maybe Anna was busy. But as days turned into weeks and the silence continued, a feeling of panic began to take root in his heart. He wrote more frequently, each letter carrying a silent urgency, as if his words could cross the distance that separated them and reach Anna wherever she was. "Anna, please write to me. I need to know that you're okay," he scribbled, his hands trembling as he tried to control the fear threatening to suffocate him. But there was no response. The absence of news was a void that grew inside Josh, a dark abyss that swallowed his hope bit by bit. He began to sleep less, eat less, his thoughts dominated by the deafening silence from the other side of the ocean. During the long nights, he lay in his tent, listening to the sounds of war in the distance. But what truly terrified him was the sound that didn't come. The sound of paper being torn open, of a letter being read. He tried to imagine all the possible reasons for Anna's silence. Maybe she was sick, or maybe her father had forbidden the letters. Worse, maybe something had happened to her. Each possibility was more terrifying than the last, and Josh found himself trapped in a cycle of anxiety and despair, unable to escape the images his mind created. The other soldiers around him noticed the change in him. Josh, who had once been seen as someone strong, now seemed like a man on the verge of collapse. He spoke less, and when he did, his voice was low, almost as if he was afraid any sound might break him completely. In a rare moment of conversation, one of the soldiers, trying to offer some comfort, suggested that maybe the letters had gotten lost, that the chaos of war was to blame. Josh just nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He wanted to believe it, needed to believe it, but the fear of the unknown was always there, gnawing away at his faith. And so, Anna's silence became more oppressive than any battle, more painful than any wound. What had once been lonely but bearable nights now turned into torment. Josh spent hours staring at the sky, searching for answers among the stars that never came. The world around him continued to crumble, but for Josh, nothing was more devastating than the emptiness left by the letters that never arrived. Each day without news was torture, a new scar on a heart already so torn apart. And in the darkness that enveloped him, Anna's absence was a pain he didn't know how to be. When the war finally ended, Josh didn't feel the explosion of joy that the other soldiers around him seemed to experience. The announcement of victory was met with cheers, hugs, and tears of relief. But for Josh, it all felt distant, as if the celebration was happening in another world, a world he no longer belonged to. All he wanted was to go home, to the small town he had so often imagined while at the front, and above all, to Anna. Returning home should have been a moment of relief, but as the train approached the station, a sense of unease settled in his chest. The familiar landscape passed by the window, but something felt wrong, out of place, as if he were seeing everything through a haze. When he finally got off at the station, he felt the crushing weight of reality descend upon him. The town looked the same at first glance, but there was a quietness he didn't remember existing before. The people he knew so well walked the streets with tired expressions, as if the war had left invisible marks on everyone. But the worst was yet to come. Josh went straight to Anna's house, his heart pounding in his chest with a mix of anxiety and hope. But when he got there, he found only closed doors and dark windows. The house was empty, abandoned, as if no one had lived there for years. The garden Anna loved so much was overgrown with weeds. The flowers she had tended with such care, now wilted and forgotten. He tried asking the neighbors, but the answers were always the same. Anna's family had left shortly after he was sent to war. No one knew where they had gone, only that Anna's father had made the decision to leave abruptly. Maybe they went to live with relatives, they said, but no one was sure. Josh felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Everything that had kept him alive during the war, the hope of returning and finding Anna, was ripped away from him in a single blow. He wandered through the streets of the town, each corner bringing a new wave of despair. The square where they used to meet, now empty and silent, seemed to mock him, as if every stone, every bench, carried the memories he could no longer bear. Directionless, Josh roamed aimlessly through the town. He went to the park where they had walked so many times, where the trees now seemed taller, darker. He sat on a bench, the same one where he had held Anna's hand for the first time, and stayed there, feeling the unbearable weight of her absence. Every place he visited was an open wound, a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. The house where he grew up, where his parents were no longer, the church where he and Anna had dreamed of getting married, now cold and empty. All that remained was the void, a crushing silence that seemed to scream Anna's name in every corner, in every shadow. Time lost meaning for Josh. The days dragged on in a succession of meaningless moments, and the night brought only the bitter solace of darkness. He avoided the people he knew, unable to bear the pity in their eyes, the questions he didn't know how to answer. What remained was the constant pain, a pain that seemed to have no end, a pain that became his only companion. And so, Josh, who once left full of hope and love, returned home only to find emptiness. The war had ended, but for him, the real battlefield was just beginning, a field where he fought against his own loneliness, against the memories that haunted him, and against the unbearable absence of Anna, who was now all he had. Weeks turned into months, and Josh's return to civilian life, far from being a relief, became a waking nightmare. The war had left deep scars on his mind, invisible wounds that didn't heal with time. At first, he tried to return to a routine, but everything felt distant, as if he were living someone else's life, a stranger in his own skin. The nights were the worst. In the dark, with his eyes open, he relived every battle, every explosion, the sound of screams echoing in his mind like an unending lament. When sleep finally came, it was disturbed by nightmares, visions so vivid that he woke up sweating, his heart racing, not knowing if he was still at the front or in his bed. And when the silence of the night enveloped him, Anna's name mingled with the chaos, a bitter reminder of everything he had lost. Josh began to avoid people. Attempts by friends and neighbors to reach out to him, to bring him back into social life, were met with a tired nod or an empty look. He locked himself in the house, the same house he once dreamed of sharing with Anna, but which now felt like a mausoleum, full of ghosts he couldn't exorcise. The windows remained closed, the curtains drawn, and sunlight barely entered. He stopped taking care of himself. Unshaven, wrinkled clothes, sunken, shadowed eyes. Josh barely ate, and what little he did eat seemed tasteless. The food that once gave him pleasure was now just a mechanical necessity, a burden he preferred to avoid. The weight loss was noticeable, but he didn't care. Life itself seemed like an unbearable burden, something he carried only by inertia, without meaning, without direction. The memories of the war haunted him during the day. He saw himself in flashes, reliving scenes of terror that returned without warning, anywhere, anytime. The sound of a door slamming or the creak of wood underfoot would make his body freeze, his heart race, as if the enemy were about to attack him again. But worse than the memories of the war were the memories of Anna. He blamed himself incessantly, believing that somehow he could have done more, should have found a way to protect her, to bring her back to him. Her absence was a constant pain, an open wound that never healed. Every thought, every happy memory they shared, was now tinged with bitter regret, a sense of loss so deep he could barely bear it. One afternoon, as the sun set, painting the sky a deep orange, Josh sat in the living room chair, the only one that still seemed to offer some comfort. He looked at the box of letters he kept by his side, Anna's letters that he had read so many times that the words were engraved in his mind. But this time, he didn't have the strength to open them. Instead, he just closed his eyes, feeling the silent tears run down his face, tears he hadn't cried since he came home. He was alone, and the weight of that loneliness was crushing. The war had taken so much from him, more than he could bear, and the future seemed like a long, empty road, with no promise, no hope. Josh lost himself in his thoughts, in a spiral of pain and despair, until the world around him faded into darkness. The years passed like a dense fog, slow and relentless, swallowing Josh in an existence that could barely be called life. Time, which for many was a balm, was for him a silent executioner, marking the rhythm of a loneliness that seemed endless. Each day was a repetition of the last, a monotonous sequence where nothing new blossomed, and memories became his only constant companion. Josh never married. The love that once filled his heart, the love he believed to be eternal, had become a prison. He found himself unable to move on, to make room for anyone else in his life. Not that there weren't opportunities. There were women who tried to get close, who saw something worthwhile in him. But Josh, always polite, always gentle, kept them at a distance. He had the sense that any bond he formed would be a betrayal of what he had once felt for Anna. And so, he remained alone, allowing the solitude to take root even more deeply. Over the years, Josh built a facade of normalcy. He worked, made friends, participated in community activities, but never truly engaged. The conversations he had were superficial. The smiles he gave were empty, automatic gestures of a man who had learned to hide the emptiness inside. People knew him as someone reserved, perhaps a bit melancholic, but no one understood the depth of his sadness, the constant pain he carried in his chest. He traveled to various places, trying to find some solace, something to fill the emptiness he felt. He saw the ocean, climbed mountains, walked through unfamiliar streets in foreign cities, but he always returned home to the same oppressive silence that followed him wherever he went. The landscapes changed, the people changed, but Josh remained the same, trapped in a time that no longer existed. The house where he had lived for so many years became a reflection of his own soul. The furniture aged, the wallpaper faded, but he never bothered to renew anything. Every object, every corner, was a reminder of what once was, and he clung to it like a castaway to a piece of wood. He had no children, no family to leave anything to, and the weight of the decades that had passed without her. Friends came and went. Some died, others moved away, and those who stayed learned not to ask questions. Josh had become a solitary figure, but not an unpleasant one. The kind of man who sat on the same park bench every day, watching the world go by without ever really being part of it. The generations changed around him, but he remained the same, a silent observer of other people's lives. In rare moments, when the loneliness became unbearable, he allowed himself to remember. Sitting in his worn leather armchair, with a cup of cold tea in his hands, he would close his eyes and return to those summer days, to Anna's face, to the sound of her laughter. He saw the park where they walked, felt the warmth of the sun on his skin, and for a brief moment, the world seemed right again. But like all memories, this one would also fade, leaving only the cold and darkness that had become his constant companions. 60 years passed like this, in a long sequence of indistinct days where the only constant was the emptiness. Josh grew old. His hair turned white, his skin wrinkled, but the pain in his chest never dissipated. He lived, yes, but it was a life in suspension, a life marked by what could have been. And so he continued, a man trapped in the past, unable to free himself from the ghosts that haunted him, walking alone through the streets of a town that had changed around him, but that, for him, remained frozen in time. It was a day like any other, one of those days when time seemed to drag on without haste, as Josh followed his routine. He had gone for his usual walk in the park. Autumn had painted the trees in shades of gold and red. and the fallen leaves formed a carpet under his feet. When he reached his usual bench, he sat down with a tired sigh, looking out at the lake in front of him, where ducks swam lazily. It was then that he saw her. Sitting on a bench not far away, a woman was watching him with an intensity he didn't understand. Josh felt a discomfort, a strange sense of déjà vu, as if he were being pulled out of his stupor by something beyond his comprehension. He lifted his eyes, staring at her for a moment, and felt his heart race. There was something about her, something that reminded him of a distant time, something familiar that he couldn't quite define. Her hair was gray, her face marked by the lines of time, but there was something in her eyes, a sparkle he knew so well. The two of them stared at each other for a moment, and Josh felt a shiver run down his spine. He hesitated, not knowing what to do, as the woman slowly stood up. Her steps were hesitant, as if she too wasn't sure what was happening. Josh rose from the bench, almost without realizing it, as if an invisible force were guiding him. When they were face to face, the world seemed to go silent, leaving only the soft sound of the wind through the trees and the distant murmur of the city. Then she smiled, a timid smile, almost imperceptible, but it broke something inside Josh. "Anna." The word came out as a whisper, incredulous, as if he were afraid that by saying it, she would disappear like a ghost. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly, as if she were struggling to believe that after so much time, they were there, together again. "Josh, I knew it was you," she said with a voice thick with emotion, her eyes never leaving his. It was the same look that had captivated him so many decades ago, the same look he thought he would never see again. Josh, who had hardened his heart against the world, felt something within him crumble. All the suffering, all the pain, all the loneliness of the past 60 years seemed to converge in that moment, in that unexpected reunion. They didn't say anything more. Words were unnecessary. Josh, with trembling hands, reached out to touch her cheek, and when their fingers met, he felt as if the life that had been suspended for so long was finally beginning to flow again. It was as if time had folded in on itself, bringing them back to a point where everything was possible, where the love they had lost could somehow be reborn from the ashes. Anna, now a widow, stood there before him, and the world Josh thought he had lost forever began to rebuild itself around them. The 60 years of separation, of pain and regret, seemed to fade away, leaving only the feeling they had always shared, even at a distance, even in silence. The park, the trees, the lake, everything around them seemed to light up with a new hope, a hope Josh never thought he would feel again. They stared at each other for a long moment, words caught in their throats. Time seemed to have frozen, and the world around them disappeared. It was just the two of them, finally reunited after a lifetime of separation and pain. Josh took a step forward, his wrinkled hands hesitantly reaching to touch Anna's face. She closed her eyes as she felt the gentle touch, a solitary tear sliding down her cheek. I thought I would never see you again," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "The war," he began, his voice faltering. "It took everything from us, didn't it?" Anna nodded silently, the memories of the dark years flooding her mind. The constant fear, the hunger, the uncertainty, all came back with a frightening clarity. "My family," she finally managed to say. "We were forced to move so quickly. The hunger, the war, the debts." He took her hand, gently squeezing it. "I know, Anna. I understand. For years, I looked for you in every face I saw on the street, in every name in the records. But it was as if you had disappeared into thin air." Anna sobbed softly, decades of pain and regret finally finding an outlet. "I never stopped loving you," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "Even when I got married, even when I had my children, you were always here." She placed her hand over her heart, her fingers clutching the fabric of her coat. Josh closed his eyes, absorbing her words. "Me too, Anna. I never stopped loving you either." They stood in silence for a long time, just existing in the same space, breathing the same air. The leaves fell around them, a silent dance of nature that seemed to echo the melancholy of the moment. They embraced there, in the middle of the park, as the cold wind blew around them. The hug was hesitant at first, but soon became firm, as if both were trying to anchor themselves in the present, leaving behind all that had hurt them, all that had kept them apart. Josh closed his eyes and felt the warmth of her body against his, smelled the familiar scent that transported him to a simpler, happier time. The days that followed were an attempt to rebuild what had been lost, to start over. But it wasn't easy. Both carried scars, and sometimes those scars reminded them that they were no longer the young people who had fallen in love in 1942. There was a caution between them, a hesitation that arose in unexpected moments, as if they feared that the happiness they were building might collapse at any moment. Anna, with her gentle nature, tried to dispel Josh's doubts. She encouraged him to talk, to open up about everything he had kept inside for so long. But Josh still struggled with the demons that haunted him. There were nights when he woke up sweating, with the screams and explosions of the war echoing in his mind. And in those moments, Anna just held his hand, in silence, offering the only thing she could: her presence, her unwavering love. As time passed, small gestures began to mean a lot. A cup of tea shared in silence, a walk by the lake, a smile exchanged at the memory of something old. It was in these little things that they found comfort, that they managed to start building something new, something that, although different, was still true. Josh, for the first time in decades, began to feel a spark of hope. It wasn't the same carefree, youthful love they once had, but a love forged through suffering, loss, and longing. It was a love that understood flaws, embraced scars, and despite everything, still had the power to warm the heart. They didn't know how much time they had left together, but they decided it didn't matter. What mattered was the present. The fact that even after 60 years of loneliness and pain, they still had a chance to live the love that had been denied to them. And in that shared quiet, in that rekindled affection, Josh and Anna found the courage to move forward, to believe that perhaps fate had given them another chance to be happy. The afternoon sun cast a gentle light over the garden where Josh and Anna were finally about to be married. After so many decades of waiting, they decided they didn't need anything grand, just the love that had united them, that had endured through time, war, and solitude. Surrounded by the few friends and family who were still around, they were ready to seal a union that, in many ways, had existed since their first meeting. Josh stood at the altar, his heart beating faster than it had in years. He looked up at the sky with his now tired eyes, thinking about everything he had lived through, everything he had lost, and how much it had cost him. Then he looked ahead and saw Anna walking towards him, each step steady and determined, as if time had never passed. Her dress, simple and elegant, fluttered softly in the breeze, and for a moment, he saw in her the young woman he had fallen in love with in 1942. She approached him with a smile that mixed joy with an unmistakable sadness, a sadness for everything that had been taken from them, for all the years they had spent apart. But in that moment, none of it mattered. When she finally reached his side, Josh felt her cold, trembling hand find his, and the world seemed to quiet, as if all the noises of the past had disappeared, leaving only the sound of their hearts beating in unison. The officiant, an old friend of Josh's, began to speak, but his words were a blur to the couple. They could only focus on each other, on how this moment felt both real and unreal, as if they were living a dream they never believed could come true. Anna, with tears in her eyes, squeezed Josh's hand a little tighter, and he, feeling the same emotion, smiled at her with a tenderness that could only come from someone who had endured so much. When it came time for the vows, Josh took Anna's hand in his and, with a voice thick with emotion, began to speak. "I never imagined we'd live to see this day, Anna. I spent 60 years thinking of you, dreaming of you, and now, finally, we can be together. I promise to love you, as I always have, until my last breath." Anna couldn't hold back her tears. Those words were everything she had waited to hear, everything she had dreamed of during the long nights of loneliness. She took a deep breath, trying to control her emotions, and replied, "Josh, you've always been the love of my life. Even when everything seemed lost, I never stopped believing that somehow we'd find our way back to each other. I love you, and I promise that as long as we're together, I'll make every day a testament to the fact that our love was always worth it." They exchanged rings, symbols of a love that had withstood the worst trials. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Josh and Anna embraced, feeling the weight of their lives lift away, leaving only the lightness of the moment. The friends around them applauded, some crying quietly, understanding the depth of that marriage, the struggle it had taken to make that moment happen. It wasn't just a celebration of love, but a celebration of resilience, of survival, of two souls who refused to give up on each other, even when the world seemed to conspire against them. In that embrace, Josh and Anna found the peace that had eluded them for so long. The garden around them, with its flowers and trees, seemed more alive than ever, as if even nature was celebrating the union that had finally been realized. And in that moment, there was no past, no future, only the present, and in it, the certainty that, despite everything, true love can indeed withstand time and adversity. The celebration that followed was modest but full of a quiet joy, a joy that came from the heart. Josh and Anna, now finally married, sat side by side, watching those who had come to celebrate with them. And in every look exchanged, in every smile, was the promise that for the time they had left, they would make each moment worthy of the love that had united them. The 4 years that followed the wedding, Josh found a new reason to smile, to live. By Anna's side, he rediscovered the life he had always dreamed of, but had believed was lost forever. Mornings were filled with walks along the seashore, where they strolled hand in hand, the waves whispering ancient secrets at their feet. Anna smiled as she saw the joy in Josh's eyes, a spark she hadn't seen since they were young. He looked like the 17-year-old boy she had met, with the same look full of hope and unconditional love. They traveled to cities they had always wanted to see, but never had the chance to visit: Paris, Rome, Las Vegas. Each place was a new adventure, each day a new memory. Josh explored these places like a young man discovering the world for the first time, with Anna always by his side, holding his hand, sharing laughter and comfortable silences. In restaurants, Josh delighted in exotic dishes, but it was the sound of Anna's laughter that made his heart race. He watched her savor each moment, and the peace it brought him was indescribable. In museums, they wandered among works of art, sharing impressions and memories of times past. Josh sometimes lingered longer before a painting, but always ended up turning to look at Anna, as if she were the most precious masterpiece in the place. The little surprises, the candlelit dinners at home, the dances in the living room to old songs, all of it made him feel alive in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He felt young, almost as if time had come full circle, giving back the years he had lost. Anna, for her part, looked at Josh and saw in the man before her the same young man she had fallen in love with. And he, in his gestures, in his soft words, in his unconditional affection, showed her every day that this love had not changed, only matured over time. The nights were always calm, a well-deserved rest after days full of happiness and small adventures. Josh would lie beside Anna with a peaceful heart, grateful for every second with her, feeling love overflow in every touch, every silent look. He often stayed awake for a few more minutes, just to watch her fall asleep, knowing that he had finally found the peace he had sought for so long. It was 4 years that passed quickly, but Josh knew he had lived them fully, the best 4 years of his life, which had finally gained color, brightness, and purpose. He was happy, truly happy, and that was something he never thought he would feel again. By Anna's side, he felt that somehow, time had given back what he had lost. One night, the soft moonlight filled the room, spreading an almost palpable serenity. Josh and Anna had shared another night of love. They had found happiness that once seemed impossible, and this happiness was reflected in every touch, every silent look exchanged under the sheets. Anna, lying beside Josh, turned to him, watching his serene face. He looked so peaceful, almost as if he were at peace with the world, and this sight made her smile. She got up slowly, trying not to wake him, but as she noticed he didn't move, something deep within her soul stirred. "Josh," she whispered, lightly touching his shoulder. The lack of response made her repeat the call, this time with more urgency. "Josh!" Her voice now carried a tone of growing desperation. She leaned over him, trying to find any sign of life, but the silence was absolute, relentless. The truth hit her like a mortal blow. Josh was gone. The man she had waited for decades, the love of her life, the companion with whom she had finally found peace, was dead. Anna was paralyzed, her eyes fixed on him, as if refusing to believe what her own senses were telling her. The room, which had once been a sanctuary of love and happiness, suddenly became a cold, empty space, filled with unbearable pain. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and disbelief. The funeral was a simple ceremony, but it was heavy with emotion. The remaining friends and family came to pay their final respects to Josh, a man who had suffered so much but had found some measure of happiness in his last years with Anna. Despite her overwhelming grief, Anna remained strong, determined to honor the man who meant so much to her. When it was time to speak, Anna approached the casket with trembling steps, her heart weighed down. She looked at Josh's face one last time, and the words began to flow, straight from her soul. "Josh," she began, her voice soft but full of emotion, "you were the light that brightened my darkest days. I waited for you for so long, and when I finally found you again, It was like the sun illuminating a new day. You always lit up my days, even without knowing it. Now that you're gone, how will I go on without my son, my love? My life will never be the same. Tears streamed down Anna's face as she spoke, each word filled with love and longing. The silence around her was profound. Everyone present felt the intensity of that moment, the pain she was carrying in every syllable. When she finished, she placed a trembling hand on the casket, as if wanting to feel Josh one last time, and whispered, "I love you, and I always will, even in other lives." As the men began to lower Josh's casket into the ground, Anna felt a sharp pain in her chest, something that made her gasp and clutch her heart. The world around her began to spin, voices and faces becoming distant blurs, and before she could react, her body gave way. Anna collapsed beside Josh's grave, the pain in her heart now unbearable, and darkness took over her vision. Panic spread among those present, but before any help could reach her, Anna was already gone. Her heart, crushed by loss and love, simply couldn't bear to go on without the great love of her life. She had followed Josh, as she always wished, into eternity, where perhaps they could finally find the peace they had so desperately sought in life. And so, side by side, they were buried together, united in death as they should have been in life. Did you like Josh's story? Do you want to hear more stories like this? Give it a like then.